She stepped into the back of a worn yellow taxi, her spirits still humming with the exhausting kindness of her shift. The driver, a man whose silence was a heavy, deliberate thing, locked the doors and looked at her reflection with eyes that saw far too much. Monica Thompson had flagged the cab at 10:14 p.m., her vibrant patterned outfit a defiant burst of color against the dark leather seats, her mind already drifting toward the quiet sanctuary of her Brooklyn apartment. In exactly 5 minutes, a black sedan would swerve to block their path, and the first bullet would puncture the night's false peace. In exactly 1 hour, she would find herself standing in the vast, shadowed hall of a mansion she was never meant to see, wondering if she had been rescued or merely claimed. But right now, the city was only rain and gold reflections. Monica leaned against the window, watching the neon signs bleed into the wet pavement, thinking of how New York had a way of making you feel both entirely present and utterly invisible. Nothing like a rainy Tuesday to remind you that you are alone in a city of millions, she thought, pulling her coat tighter. She lived in the spaces between people, the caregiver who smoothed the pillows of the dying, the woman who smiled at strangers who looked right through her. Some people were meant to be cherished, she supposed, and others were simply meant to keep the world running in the background. She watched her phone screen flicker and die, a final blink of light before the darkness. When the taxi had pulled up, its windows tinted like secrets, she hadn't checked the license plate. She had only felt the sudden, desperate relief of a dry seat and a way home. 4th Street, please, she said, sinking into the seat. My phone is dead, but the app should have updated the fare. Could you turn up the heat? The cold today feels like a personal insult. A voice cut through her chatter, sharp and cold as a winter morning in Seoul. Who are you? Monica's eyes snapped to the rearview mirror. The man in the front seat had turned, his face a landscape of hard lines and shadows, his eyes frozen chips of blue pinning her in place. He looked at her not as a passenger, but as an intrusion he was currently deciding how to discard. I'm the person who called the cab, she stammered, the warmth in her chest beginning to curdle into fear. You're supposed to be taking me home. He did not answer. His gaze flicked to the side mirror, and his jaw tightened with a sudden, lethal focus. The taxi lurched forward with a violence that threw her back against the seat. Wait, what are you doing? She cried, reaching for the door handle. Stop the car. Another car, sleek and predatory, pulled alongside them. A window rolled down. The glint of metal, the scream that left Monica was a raw, primal thing. Before she could move, a hand shot back, gripped her shoulder, and shoved her toward the floor. Down, he said. It was not a request. It was a command that brooked no world other than his own. Monica's life in New York was a series of small, rhythmic duties, a quiet catalog of care that left her bones aching with a weary sort of satisfaction. Every night, the ritual was the same. She would peel off her surgical gloves, the scent of antiseptic lingering like a memory on her skin, and step out from the care facility into the cool, indifferent air of the city. She carried her exhaustion lightly, a woman of vibrant patterns and a bold afro that refused to be dimmed by the gray utilitarianism of her shifts. For a week now, the yellow taxi had been there, waiting at the curb like a loyal, silent dog. She did not know his name, only the shape of his stillness. She would climb into the back seat, the dark leather cool against her thighs, and exhale a breath she felt she had been holding since morning. She never had to state her destination. The driver, his cap pulled low to shield a face that seemed carved from a harder, more expensive stone than the sidewalk, simply knew. He knew the precise turn toward 4th Street, the way the streetlights caught the rain on the glass, and the exact moment to accelerate into the blur of red and gold reflections. Another long one, Monica would say, her voice a warm current in the quiet cabin. She talked because silence in New York felt like a forfeit, a way of admitting one was truly alone. She told him about the elderly woman who had finally smiled, the bitterness of the coffee in the break room, and the quiet wonder of the city lights sliding across the rain-streaked window. She treated him with a simple, unadorned kindness, unaware that she was speaking to a man who controlled empires across continents. Min-Seok Devon listened. He watched her in the rearview mirror, his sharp eyes following the reflection of her smile with a clinical, predatory focus that was slowly beginning to feel like something else. He noticed the way the golden light touched her face and the confidence in her voice, a stark contrast to the betrayal and secrecy that had forced him behind the wheel of a cab. To the world, he was invisible, a man in an ordinary jacket. But beneath his sleeve, the glint of a luxury watch marked the time of a life she could not imagine. He was a man of ice, yet he found himself memorizing the map of her 4th Street. Not because it was his job, but because for those 20 minutes, she made him feel like a man who actually belonged in the world he drove through. The taxi moved with a predatory grace through the rain-slicked theater of Manhattan. The world outside reduced to a blur of red and gold reflections against the dark leather seats. Monica leaned her head back, her bold afro brushing the window, her mind still cluttered with the small, soft labors of her day, the way Mrs. Gable had clutched her hand. The smell of lavender and antiseptic that always seemed to cling to her patterned sleeves. She was talking, as she always did, a rhythmic outpouring of words intended to fill the strange, heavy quiet of the cabin. She spoke of the dampness in the air and the way the city lights looked like spilled jewels on the wet asphalt, her voice a warm, vibrant current against the chill. She did not notice at first that the silence from the front seat had changed. It was no longer the passive quiet of a service worker, but something sharper, a stillness that felt like a held breath. Monica glanced up, her playful smile faltering as her eyes met the rearview mirror. There, framed by the plastic casing and the low-slung cap, were his eyes. They were not the eyes of a cab driver weary from a night shift. They were chips of frozen blue, clinical and startlingly intense, cataloging her with a focus that made the air in the car feel suddenly thin. He was not looking at her. He was assessing her, his gaze following the line of her throat and the confidence in her expression with an unnerving, predatory precision. Monica's rambling slowed. The playful comment she had been about to make something about New York drivers and their secret lives died in her throat. The glint of the luxury watch peeked from beneath his sleeve as he adjusted his grip on the wheel. A flash of silver that seemed to mock the worn-out interior of the cab. "You're very quiet tonight," she said, her voice sounding smaller than she intended, a faint tremor betraying her sudden awareness of the man behind the wheel. Most drivers have at least one story about a passenger they'd rather forget. He did not blink. His gaze remained pinned on her reflection, unwavering and dangerously calm. When he finally spoke, his voice did not merely break the silence. It cut through her lingering thoughts like a blade, cold and precise, stripped of all unnecessary emotion. "Who are you?" The question was so stark, so devoid of the usual pleasantries of a transaction, that Monica felt a shiver of true crystalline fear. He did not ask for her name. He asked for her essence, his voice carrying the weight of a man accustomed to deciding who was an inconvenience and who was a threat. Beneath the ordinary jacket, the silhouette of his shoulders suggested a power that had nothing to do with driving a car. Monica stared back into the mirror, her heart beginning a frantic, uneven rhythm. Realizing that the man watching her was someone who inhabited the shadows she usually tried so hard to light, Min-Seok kept his eyes on the road, but his mind was a fractured map of Seoul, a city of glass and steel where he had been king until the foundations turned to sand. The betrayal remained in his throat like a swallowed stone, sharp, cold, and heavy. It had been his own blood, or those he treated as such, who had bartered his life for a seat at a table he had built with his own hands. This Manhattan exile, this masquerade in a fraying yellow taxi, was a necessary indignity, a way to breathe while he calculated the exact weight of his retribution. He lived in a world of clinical silences and measured breaths, where every movement was a transaction and every word a potential blade. It was a world that made sense to him, orderly, detached, and devoid of the messy entanglements of hope. Then there was Monica. She sat behind him, a riot of colors and unearned joy, her bold afro and patterned jacket a thumb in the eye of his carefully curated shadows. To Min-Seok, her vibrant spirit was not a gift, it was a profound inconvenience. She was an anomaly in his data, a constant, humming reminder of a life that did not rely on fear or force. Her warmth was a distraction he could ill afford while the wolves were still scenting for his blood. He watched her in the mirror, his gaze tracking the way her fingers traced the condensation on the window with a quiet, childlike wonder. She talked about the smallness of her day, the temperature of a patient's room, the taste of a cheap orange, as if these things mattered in a universe governed by power. It irritated him, the way she offered her kindness so freely, like a woman who had never known the sharp edge of a knife or the hollow sound of a broken promise. She was soft in a way that invited violence. And yet, there was a terrifying strength in her refusal to be dimmed by the city's gray indifference. Min-Seok shifted his hand on the wheel, the luxury watch beneath his sleeve a cold weight against his skin. He wanted to despise her for her light, for the way she made his own darkness feel like a choice rather than a destiny. She was a passenger he should have dropped off days ago, a witness to his hidden life. And yet he found himself slowing down at the red lights, lingering in the quiet theater of the cab just to hear the rhythm of a heart that did not beat for war. The rain continued its rhythmic assault on the roof of the taxi, but the atmosphere inside had shifted, the air thick with a sudden, sharp clarity. Monica felt the change in her marrow. It was not just the coldness of the driver's voice or the unsettling glint of the luxury watch that had slipped from beneath his sleeve. It was the way the car itself seemed to grow alert, as if the metal and leather were responding to the man's silent command. She caught his eyes in the mirror again, but they were no longer pinned on her. They were fixed on the world behind them, tracking something in the blur of red and gold reflections. Monica turned in her seat, her bold afro brushing the headrest, and squinted through the rain-streaked rear window. A black SUV, sleek and predatory, was weaving through the traffic with a terrifying, single-minded focus. It did not have the erratic energy of a New York driver in a hurry. It had the measured, heavy gait of a hunter. "Is everything okay?" she asked, her voice a fragile thing against the low hum of the engine. Min-Seok did not answer with words. He answered with the car. The taxi lurched forward, the engine roaring with a power that felt entirely wrong for a vehicle that looked so worn. Monica was thrown back against the seat, her hands grasping for purchase on the dark leather. The world outside began to tilt. Min-Seok took a corner onto a narrow side street, the tires screaming against the wet asphalt, the maneuver so precise and violent that it felt like an act of war. Monica's breath hitched. A normal cab driver would have cursed, would have leaned on the horn, would have complained about the madness of the night. But this man was silent, his jaw a carved line of granite, his hands on the wheel moving with a predatory grace that suggested he had spent his life navigating much more dangerous terrains than a Manhattan grid. "You're not a driver," she whispered, the realization hitting her with the force of a physical blow. She saw the way he checked the mirrors, the clinical way he calculated the distance between them and the following shadow. And she realized that the quiet driver she had spent a week chatting to was a ghost, a mask for someone who moved in a world where corners were taken at the speed of survival. The vibrant patterns of her jacket seemed to pulse in the dim light, a splash of life in a cabin that had suddenly become a cockpit of steel and intent. She was no longer just a passenger going to 4th Street. She was a witness to a life that had finally dangerously broken through its disguise. The taxi slowed, not with the hesitant braking of a man looking for a house number, but with a heavy, final deceleration that signaled the end of one life and the beginning of another. They had reached the edge of a neighborhood where the brownstones stood like silent, judgmental sentinels, their windows dark and unblinking in the rain. Monica stared at the back of the driver's head, her heart a frantic bird trapped in the cage of her ribs. The silence in the car was no longer the comfortable quiet of her nightly ritual. It was thick, weighted with the unspoken. Min-Seok turned in his seat. He moved with a slow, deliberate grace that made the worn fabric of the cab seem like a temporary skin he was preparing to shed. He looked at her, then really looked at her, his gaze traveling from the vibrant, geometric patterns of her jacket to the wide, startled amber of her eyes. He saw the way she clutched her bag, the way her bold afro seemed to quiver with her shallow breaths. In the dim amber glow of a distant streetlight, his eyes were as cold as the sea off the coast of Incheon. "You have the eyes of a creature that does not belong here," he said, his voice a low, melodic rasp that seemed to vibrate against the glass. A deer that wandered onto a highway, thinking the headlights were the sun. Monica swallowed, her throat dry and tight. "I'm just a woman trying to get home. I'm a caregiver. I help people." A ghost of a smile, sharp and devoid of warmth, touched his lips. It was a look of clinical assessment, of a man who had spent his life deciding what was worth keeping and what was merely an obstacle. He leaned closer, the scent of wood smoke and expensive soap suddenly overwhelming the smell of damp Manhattan air. "Bambi," he murmured. The name fell from his lips like a verdict, a strange, diminutive label that felt like a collar. "You are a deer in the wrong forest, and the wolves have already seen you. You think your kindness is a shield, but here it is only a target." Monica felt a hot flash of indignation rise beneath her fear. "My name is Monica. I am not a cartoon, and I am not a prey animal." Min-Seok did not blink. He merely watched her, his ice blue eyes cataloging her defiance as if it were a curious, short-lived phenomenon. He reached out, his fingers hovering just inches from the glass between them, the luxury watch on his wrist catching a glint of red light. "For tonight, you are whatever I decide you are." Because in this forest, I am the only thing keeping you alive. He turned back to the wheel, the doors remaining locked with a soft, mechanical finality, leaving Monica alone in the back seat with a name she hated and a man she was beginning to realize she might never truly escape. The taxi did not return to the familiar, crumbling asphalt of 4th Street. Instead, it moved northward, a silent yellow ghost carving through the rain until the city's frantic energy began to thin, replaced by the hushed, expensive stillness of a neighborhood where the trees were manicured and the gates were high. Monica watched the world transform through the streaked window, her bold afro pressing against the glass as a heavy iron gate groaned open to admit them. The mansion loomed out of the mist like a grand, stone secret, a Gothic structure draped in weeping ivy and the cold glow of security lights. When Min-Seok finally killed the engine, the silence was absolute, broken only by the rhythmic ticking of the cooling metal. He stepped out and opened her door, his movement a fluid, predatory grace that left no room for protest. "Inside," he said, his voice a low vibration that seemed to pull at the very air in her lungs. The foyer was a cavern of marble and shadowed oil paintings, smelling of beeswax and something ancient. But it was the people who stopped Monica's breath. In the center of the hall stood 3 men, tall, broad-shouldered sentinels with faces like unread maps, their suits fitting with a precision that suggested the weapons hidden beneath. They did not look at her with curiosity. They looked at her with a clinical, detached assessment, as if she were a package delivered in error. Then, the heavy silence was fractured by the sound of rapid, rhythmic footsteps. A woman emerged from the shadows of the dining hall, small, sturdy, with hair the color of brushed silver and eyes that possessed a startling, earthy warmth. She wore an apron over a dark silk dress, and as she approached, the predatory tension in the room seemed to bend, then soften. "Min-Seok," the woman said, her voice a rich, melodic scolding. She ignored the soldiers entirely, her gaze fixing on Monica with an intensity that felt like a physical touch. She took Monica's hands still cold from the rain, and squeezed them with a strength that was both surprising and grounding. "She is too thin." "Why is she so thin?" "In this house, we do not feed the shadows." Monica looked at the woman, then at the men who stood like iron statues, and finally at Min-Seok, who remained by the door, his luxury watch glinting as he crossed his arms. He looked at Monica, his Bambi, with an unreadable expression. A man who had brought a splash of vibrant, patterned life into a fortress of stone and secrets. "This is Mrs. Han," Min-Seok said, his voice losing none of its edge even as his eyes flickered toward the older woman. "She runs this house, and for now, you are under her care. Do not try the windows, Monica. The glass here is stronger than your will." The guest room was an exercise in overwhelming grace, a space of heavy silks and the scent of jasmine, but to Monica, it felt like a beautifully lacquered box. She spent the night watching the rain turn into a fine, gray mist against the reinforced glass, her heart a restless thing that refused to be soothed by the high thread count of the sheets. By morning, the vibrant geometric patterns of her own clothes felt like a suit of armor she was ready to use. She descended the marble staircase with a quiet, measured purpose, her bold afro a dark crown against the pale stone walls. She found the foyer empty, the soldiers having vanished into the shadows of the house, and for a moment, the heavy iron-bound front door looked like a simple exit rather than a boundary. She reached for the handle, her fingers trembling with the memory of the quiet driver who had become a predator. But before her palm could touch the cold metal, a voice stopped her. "I would not do that." Monica, Min-Seok was standing on the landing above, his silhouette sharp and clinical. He had shed the driver's jacket for a charcoal sweater that looked like it cost a year of her salary, the luxury watch on his wrist catching the morning light with a cold, rhythmic glint. "I have a shift," Monica said, her voice lifting with a defiance she didn't entirely feel. "I have patients who need their medication. I am not a character in your dark play, Min-Seok. I am a person with a life." "You had a life," he replied, descending the stairs with a predatory grace that made the air between them feel suddenly thin. "Until the Valentis saw you in my car. Until they saw me drive a taxi through a gunfight just to keep you breathing." He reached the bottom and stood before her, his ice blue eyes pinning her in place. He didn't touch her, yet she felt the weight of his possession like a physical shroud. In their world, there are no coincidences. They do not see a caregiver who got into the wrong car. They see a woman I chose to protect. They see my weakness. They see my woman. The words landed with the finality of a closing tomb. Monica felt a hot flush of indignation. "I am no one's woman. I am Monica Thompson." Min-Seok leaned in, his scent of wood smoke and expensive soap clouding her judgment. "To me, you are Monica, but to the men waiting at the end of this driveway, you are leverage. If you walk out that door, you aren't going to work. You are going to a shallow grave or a cage much smaller than this one." He turned away, leaving her standing by the door, her hand still hovering near the handle. She looked at her reflection in the polished marble, the bold Afro, the vibrant patterns, and realized with a sickening jolt that she was no longer invisible. The light she had carried so stubbornly had finally made her a target. The boxes arrived in the afternoon, matte black and heavy with the scent of high-end boutiques, laid across the ivory silk of her bed like a challenge. Monica stood over them, her hands resting on the vibrant, geometric cotton of her own skirt, feeling a sudden, sharp pang of displacement. She had not asked for gifts. She had asked for her life back. Yet, when she opened the first box, her breath hitched in her throat. Inside was a dress of deep, burnt orange silk, the exact shade of a sunset over a Lagos market, accented with bold, hand-painted patterns that mirrored the eccentric geometry she loved. It was not the muted, clinical gray of Min-Seok's world. It was a garment that recognized her. There were cashmere sweaters in rich ochre and trousers tailored with a precision that suggested they would hug her curves as if they had been molded to her skin, she realized then. With a jolt of heat that started in her chest and moved to her fingertips, that he had been watching her with an intensity that was more than predatory. He had been measuring with his eyes, cataloging the width of her shoulders, the arc of her hips, and the specific, bold joy of her aesthetic while she had been busy chatting about the weather and her patients. She was wearing the silk dress when she found him in the library, a room of dark wood and the smell of old paper that seemed to swallow the afternoon light. Min-Seok sat behind a desk of carved mahogany, the luxury watch on his wrist ticking away the seconds of his exile with a cold, rhythmic indifference. He did not look up immediately, but the air in the room grew thick, charged with the sudden, electric awareness of her presence. "It fits," she said, her voice sounding steadier than she felt. Min-Seok finally lifted his gaze. His ice blue eyes traveled slowly, deliberately, from the hem of the silk dress up to the dark, beautiful crown of her afro. There was no apology in his expression, only a devastating, clinical satisfaction. "I do not like things that are ill-fitting, Monica," he said, his voice a low vibration that seemed to pull at the very fabric she wore. "And I do not like it when you try to dim yourself to fit into a room. You are a riot of color in a world of gray. It would be a waste to change that." Monica clutched the silk at her sides, realizing that his possession was not just of her body, but of her identity. He had seen the spirit she thought was her own private armor and had decided to clothe it in his own wealth. She was still a prisoner, but he had replaced her cage of iron with one of finest silk, and the terrifying truth was that he knew her tastes better than anyone who had ever claimed to love her. The transition from the velvet silence of the mansion to the screaming violence of the street happened with a terrifying clinical speed. Min-Seok had decided, with that characteristic stony finality, that Monica needed the air of the city, or perhaps he simply needed to see her vibrant spirit against a backdrop that wasn't his own shadow. They were in a different car, a nondescript black sedan that smelled of nothing, moving through a part of the city where the rain had turned the gutters into rushing, silver rivers. Monica sat beside him in her burnt orange silk, her bold afro a dark, defiant cloud against the headdress. She was beginning to speak of the rhythm of the rain when the world shattered. A silver SUV lurched from a side street, the impact glancing but enough to send their car spinning across the slick asphalt. The screech of metal on metal was a high, keening note that seemed to vibrate in Monica's very teeth. Before she could find her breath, the air was punctured by the rhythmic, hollow pop-pop-pop of gunfire. "Get down!" Min-Seok's voice was no longer a low vibration. It was a blade unsheathed. He didn't wait. He moved with a predatory, liquid grace that made the chaos outside seem sluggish. He was out of the car before the glass had even finished raining onto the upholstery. Monica huddled in the footwell, her silk dress bunched around her knees, her heart a frantic, panicked drum. Through the shattered remains of the passenger window, she saw him. Min-Seok stood in the center of the rain-lashed street, a figure carved from ice and fury. He had shed the ordinary jacket of the cab driver, and in his charcoal sweater, he looked like an avenging angel of the underworld. The rain plastered his hair to his forehead, and his ice-blue eyes burned with a lethal, terrifying clarity. He moved with a devastating economy of motion, his own weapon barking back at the silver SUV, his silhouette a dark anchor in the swirling mist. He was no longer the man who listened to her stories about patience and coffee. He was the man who decided, who lived, and who became a memory. The SUV sped away, tires screaming in retreat, leaving a heavy, gunpowder-scented silence in its wake. Min-Seok did not chase them. He turned back to the car, his chest heaving with a controlled, rhythmic intensity. He opened the door and reached for her, his fingers warm and steady against her trembling shoulder. The luxury watch on his wrist glinted, a cold, indifferent witness to the violence. "Are you hurt, Monica?" he asked, his voice rough, stripped of its clinical detachment. She looked up at him, at the man who had just traded bullets for her life, and realized that the quiet driver was dead. In his place stood a master of shadows who looked at her as if she were the only light left in a world gone dark. The following days were a slow, thick syrup of domesticity and dread. Min-Seok spent them in the library, a room where the shadows seemed to have more weight than the furniture, surrounded by a fortress of white paper. He was a man drowning in the digital and physical debris of his own empire, trying to find the crack through which the betrayal had leaked. His high-priced lawyers, men with voices like expensive sandpaper and shoes that never creaked, had spent weeks combing through these files and found nothing but the cold efficiency of their own billing hours. Monica entered the room with a tray of tea, her burnt orange silk rustling a bright, defiant sound in a room that preferred silence. She did not leave as she usually did. Instead, she stood by the desk, her gaze drifting over the scattered documents. She carried with her the caregiver's eye, a specific, sharpened intuition born from years of noticing the slight change in a patient's breathing or the tiny, irregular tremor of a hand that everyone else ignored. "Why is he still signing?" she asked, her voice a warm, sudden intrusion. Min-Seok looked up, his blue eyes bloodshot from lack of sleep. "What are you talking about, Monica?" She leaned over the mahogany desk, her bold afro casting a soft shadow over the papers. She pointed to a signature on a series of property transfers dated only 3 months ago. "This man, Arthur Bennington." The notary, Min-Seok's jaw tightened. "He is one of the most reliable notaries in the city. He's handled the Valenti accounts for decades. He handled them until he died," Monica said quietly. "He was a patient at the facility where I worked. I was the one who sat with him during his final hours in the winter of 2019. He had no family, only a collection of old jazz records and a lingering regret about a daughter in Seattle." The silence that followed was absolute, the kind of silence that precedes a landslide. Min-Seok stood up, his movement a fluid, predatory grace. He pulled a stack of recent contracts toward him, his fingers one adorned with the cold, rhythmic glint of his luxury watch trembling with a sudden, lethal energy. Monica watched him, her vibrant spirit a stark contrast to the dark revelation in the files. She had found the fracture. For 4 years, a dead man's seal had been used to legitimize an entire underworld's assets. It was a mistake born of the arrogance of powerful men who assumed that the people who care for the dying never bothered to remember their names. Min-Seok looked at her, and for the first time, the predatory focus in his eyes was eclipsed by a profound, startling respect. He realized then that his Bambi had done what a small army of lawyers could not. She had handed him the sword to dismantle his enemies, not with violence, but with the simple, devastating power of having paid attention. The library, usually a fortress of unyielding shadows and the dry, academic scent of old parchment, felt different that evening. The rain had finally tapered off into a hesitant mist, and the fireplace threw long, flickering fingers of amber light across the spines of books that Min-Seok never seemed to read. Monica sat on the velvet sofa, her bold afro haloed by the firelight, her burnt orange silk dress shimmering with every breath. She was watching him, really watching him as he sat in his mahogany chair, the luxury watch on his wrist silent for once. A piece of cold metal that had stopped pretending to measure anything that mattered. The revelation of the dead notary had stripped the room of its clinical detachment. There were no lawyers now, no soldiers standing guard at the threshold. There was only the heavy, expectant air between two people who had been thrown together by a mistake that was beginning to look like destiny. Min-Seok stood up, his movement lacking its usual predatory grace, replaced by a strange, heavy-limbed hesitation. He walked toward her and stopped, looking down at his own hands that had built empires and destroyed men with the same indifferent efficiency. "I have lived my life in a world where warmth is a tactical error," he said. his voice a low, jagged vibration that seemed to catch in the back of his throat. He did not look at her, but she could see the tension in his jaw, the way the ice blue of his eyes had darkened into something resembling grief. I do not know how to be gentle, Monica. It is a language I never learned to speak. Monica reached out, her vibrant patterns a splash of startling life in the dim room, and touched his hand. His skin was warm, a surprise that always made her heart stutter. You are trying, she whispered. That is a language of its own. He looked at her then, and for a fleeting second, the Ice King of Soul vanished. In his place was a man who looked terrified by the very softness he was beginning to crave. He turned his hand over, lacing his long, scarred fingers through hers. The luxury watch catching the firelight like a fallen star. I am trying, he admitted, the words sounding raw and unpracticed, as if they were being dragged out of him against his will. Because when I look at you, I realize that I have spent 40 years breathing without ever once feeling alive. I do not want to be the man who protects you because it is his duty. I want to be the man who deserves to hold your hand in the light. He leaned down, his forehead resting against hers, and in that quiet theater of the library, Monica felt the first true crack in the ice. It was a terrifying, beautiful sound, the sound of a winter finally beginning to end. The kitchen was a cavern of brushed steel and shadow, smelling of rosemary and the cold, sharp scent of the rain that still lingered on the window panes. It was 2 o'clock a.m., an hour that stripped the city of its pretenses, leaving only the raw, humming core of things. Monica sat on the edge of the marble island, her burnt orange silk dress bunched around her thighs, her bold afro a dark, soft silhouette against the glow of the under-cabinet lights. She had come down for water, for a way to quench the heat that had been building in her chest since the library. But she had found him instead. Min-Seok stood between her knees, his presence a heavy, air-stealing weight. He had shed his sweater, wearing only a white t-shirt that clung to the ridges of his shoulders. And for the first time, the luxury watch on his wrist felt like an intrusion, a piece of cold machinery in a moment that was entirely, devastatingly human. He did not touch her, not yet, but the space between them vibrated with a tension that felt like a held breath. You should be sleeping. Monica, he said, his voice a low, jagged rasp that seemed to vibrate in the very marrow of her bones. I couldn't, she whispered. The honesty of it felt like a forfeit. He leaned in, his hands bracing against the marble on either side of her hips, his ice blue eyes darkening until they were the color of the sea at midnight. He was so close that she could smell the wood smoke on his skin and the faint, clean scent of the soap Mrs. Han favored. It was a moment of torture disguised as restraint. He was a man who had spent his life taking what he wanted, yet he stood there, his jaw locked in a hard, disciplined line, waiting for permission he didn't know how to ask for. Monica reached out, her fingers tracing the sharp, carved angle of his jaw, the vibrant geometry of her spirit finally meeting the cold architecture of his. She felt the tremor in him, a slight, rhythmic vibration that betrayed the Ice King persona he wore like armor. I want to kiss you, he murmured, the words sounding like a confession, or perhaps a warning. But I have never known how to want something without wanting to own it. And you, Monica, you are not something that can be owned. He leaned closer, his mouth a mere heartbeat away from hers, his breath hot against her skin. He lingered there, in the agonizing middle ground of desire, his eyes searching hers for a sign that she was ready to burn with him. It was a clinical sort of agony, a slow burn awareness that made her heart slam against her ribs. In the quiet theater of the kitchen, beneath the cold glint of the luxury watch, Monica realized that his restraint was the most terrifying, beautiful gift he had ever given her. She closed the distance herself, her hands fisting in his shirt. Pulling the predator into the light, the dismantling of the Valenti Empire did not happen with the vulgarity of a street brawl, but with the quiet, devastating efficiency of a scalpel. Armed with the revelation of the dead notary, Min-Seok's return to power was a masterpiece of clinical retribution. In the shadowed boardrooms of Seoul and the glass towers of Manhattan, foundations that had seemed like iron began to liquefy. Assets were frozen, legitimate fronts were exposed as hollowed-out shells, and the men who had bartered Min-Seok's life found themselves standing on ground that was no longer theirs. Monica watched the transformation from the quiet theater of the library. Min-Seok was no longer the man in the ordinary jacket. He had stepped back into the sharp, tailored architecture of his true self. Yet, the way he looked at her remained unchanged, a gaze that saw through the vibrant patterns of her orange silk to the sharpened intelligence beneath. He had reclaimed his throne, but he had done so using the weapons she had handed him, a realization that had permanently altered the geography of his heart. On the evening the final surrender was signed, the mansion was filled with a celebratory silence, the soldiers standing at a more respectful distance than before. Min-Seok found Monica by the fireplace, her bold afro haloed in the amber light, her presence a splash of vivid life in the dark woodroom. He did not speak of the victory or the Valentis. He walked toward her, his predatory grace now tempered by a strange, heavy-limbed humility. He reached into his pocket and produced a velvet box, opening it to reveal a diamond that seemed to have captured the very essence of the city's cold, brilliant lights. He took her hand, the hand of a caregiver, strong and practiced in the art of noticing, and slid the ring onto her finger. It did not snag or slide. It was a devastating, perfect fit. I have spent my life measuring people by what I can take from them, he said, his voice a low, jagged rasp that vibrated in the quiet room. But I measured you, Monica, because I realized I had finally found the only thing I could not afford to lose. He did not look at the ring. He looked at her, his ice blue eyes open in a way that signaled the end of his long, frozen winter. Monica looked down at the glint of the luxury watch on his wrist and then at the diamond on her own hand, realizing that the quiet driver had not only taken her to a new destination but had built a whole new world for her to inhabit. The caregiver had finally been cared for, and for the first time in New York, the vibrant spirit she carried felt entirely. Safely home, the transition from the old year to the new was not marked by the hollow, forced cheer of the parties Monica had once fled, but by a profound and heavy stillness. New Year's Eve in New York had always felt like a personal affront to her, a loud, neon-soaked reminder of the spaces where she did not fit. But tonight, as she stood on the sweeping stone balcony of the mansion, the city below was merely a distant, glittering carpet of light, and the silence was a garment that actually fit. The snow fell with a rhythmic, unhurried grace, covering the Gothic eaves in a soft, white shroud that seemed to absorb the city's frantic noise. Monica leaned against the cold marble railing, her bold afro dusted with fine, crystalline flakes, her spirit finally unburdened by the weight of being overlooked. She wore a wrap of heavy, emerald velvet over her silk dress, a splash of vibrant, royal color that refused to be swallowed by the winter gray. She thought of the woman who had stepped into a yellow taxi just a week ago, a woman with blisters on her feet and a dead phone. A woman who believed her only value lay in the care she gave to those who were already leaving the world. That woman had been invisible, a ghost moving through the rain. But the woman standing here now was seen. She was a woman whose observational gaze had dismantled an empire and whose presence had thawed a heart made of clinical ice. A familiar warmth settled against her back. And she didn't need to turn to know it was him. Min-Seok wrapped his arms around her, his charcoal wool coat a solid, protective anchor. He rested his chin on her shoulder, the luxury watch on his wrist catching the dim light of the snow, no longer a symbol of a hidden life, but a steady, rhythmic witness to their shared time. "What are you thinking, Monica?" he murmured, his voice a low, jagged rasp that she had come to crave like a song. "I was thinking that I spent 2 years in the city trying to find a door that wasn't locked," she whispered, turning in the circle of his arms to face him, her vibrant patterns pressed against his dark coat, a beautiful, messy collision of two worlds. "And it turns out, I just had to get into the wrong car to find the right home." Min-Seok looked at her, his ice blue eyes no longer chips of frozen sky, but deep, dark pools of a devotion he was still learning to name. He kissed her forehead, his touch possessed of a gentleness he had once claimed was a tactical error. "Welcome home, Monica," he said, the words falling soft as the snow. She looked out over the city, no longer a stranger in a cold forest, but a woman standing in the light of her own making, finally, irrevocably home.